Hello, this is Sarah Ruiz, and today I'm going to show you how I make and baste circles for needle turn applique. And this is in support of my pattern called Game Night, which has some applique shapes, but this process can work for anything that you need circles for. So I am starting with, this is my square of fabric. This is my circle template. I printed this out on my computer, but then I glued the paper to a file folder to make it really nice and stiff. And you'll see why that's important in a little bit. So step one is I am going to cut out my circle. So because I'm going to do needle turn applique, I need to make sure to add seam allowance. If you look on this template is the finished piece size. Add seam allowance if needed. So if you were doing fusible, then you would just cut out the shape, but I am doing needle turn applique. So I'm going to cut just real roughly, approximately a 1/4 inch from the edge. So this is an 8-inch circle. I know my square was 8.5 inches. So it's easy for me to just cut off each of these corners. It does not have to be perfect. Looks like I need a new rotary cutter blade. And this is really awkward because I'm doing it for video. Normally I would turn it, but there we go. Okay, so here is my circle. The next thing I'm going to do is hand stitch a gathering stitch around the edge of this. And I'm going to keep it within the 1/4 inch seam allowance. But I have a long piece of thread on a needle that I've prepared. This is 50 weight thread. It really doesn't matter too much what weight you use. I don't even have a knot tied in the end because I'm not going to need it. So what I do is start here, pull it through, leave a little bit of a tail, and then I am just going to stitch all the way around the edge of this circle. I'm not being super careful with my stitch length here because it's a large circle. The gathering stitch can be pretty long. If you want to do a smaller circle, maybe your gathering stitch is a little shorter, but my stitch length right now is like a 1/4 inch. I mean, it's pretty long. This is not going to secure anything. This is simply to gather the circle and make it nice and tight. All right, so I'm going to keep stitching until I've gone around the entire perimeter of this circle. Okay, I am finishing up my line of stitches here, and it's a little hard to see. I did use gray thread, but there's a line of stitches around the entire perimeter of the circle, and here's my 2 thread tails right here. These are just loose, no knots. So now I am going to bring in my pressing board for the next step. So what you're going to do is lay down your circle right side down, wrong side up, and you can see my gathering stitches are already starting to do their work. I'm going to put my template back in the middle, and this is why it's important that this template be pretty stiff. So you can do the file folder technique like I did. You can use template plastic, just something that gives it some more thickness than a standard printer piece of paper. Then you're going to take those thread tails and pull them just like I did. And you can see how the fabric wraps itself very, very nicely around the circle. Now, while I'm holding those thread tails, I'm going to come through and start pressing. And here's another thing that I like to do. I have a little bowl right here. This is liquid starch. This is Best Press, but you can use any kind of liquid starch. And I just have like an old paintbrush that I think I stole from one of my kids. But I like to paint this liquid starch on my seam allowance like this before I press it. And what this does is it really helps you get a nice crisp edge to your circle. You can see from the back, I mean, my seam allowance is not perfect on the back. It's not a perfect 1/4 inch all the way around. You can adjust your template as needed. You can shift it a little bit to try and get this seam allowance perfect. But for me, like, it's good enough. I mean, I'm going to stitch this down to a background square. And then in the end of my quilt, it's all going to get quilted over. So I am not concerned that this seam allowance is not big enough. It's maybe 3/16 of an inch instead of a full 1/4 inch. But you can see, I will adjust that just a little bit. And then I'm going to flip it over. I'm going to press my circle from the front side. If you want, sometimes I'll even, you know, brush some starch on the edges from the front side. And again, it just helps it get really crisp. All right. Once you are done with that, it is really simple. You just remove your template. And now you have this really nice circle. Once you remove your template, you may find that you need to press your seams again. I usually do. You still have these gathering stitches in, so if it came up a little bit, you can just go give those a gentle pull. It'll pull those edges back in. And then your circle is ready to be attached to the background. You have one more choice to make. You can leave these gathering stitches in. They're not going to be seen. Or you can take them out. I think I'll go ahead and take them out. Why not? So I'm just going to gently, just going to crunch up your circle a little bit, but that's part of why I like to use that starch. So there. All right, my gathering stitches are out. I'm gonna press the edges one more time now that those stitches are gone. And this circle is ready to applique. So at this point, I have my background square that I'm going to applique this onto. I have already gone ahead and marked it. It's a little hard to see, but I have creases here, 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 here that'll show me the centers of each side of the block. And so I'm going to just fold my circle in half and finger press the edges here. And that's going to help me align my circle with the background. All right, so now it's time to line it up. And that looks pretty good. At this point, I will grab a couple pins and stick them in here just to keep it in place. I'll usually pin one side, the side that I'm going to start stitching on, and then leave the other side loose, and I will go around and adjust and pin as I stitch. So to stitch this down, I have another needle that's already threaded. This is 80 weight thread. So for needle turn applique, or not needle turn, for hand applique, I like to use a really thin thread. I think it makes it a lot easier for those stitches to just fade into the fabric and you don't really see them. So for this one, I am going to tie a knot in the end of it. And then to start stitching, I just stick my needle through this seam allowance. So I'm basically burying the knot right in that seam allowance. And then I start stitching. I try and I don't use a super short stitch length here. My goal is just to secure this circle well to the background. I know with this quilt, I'm going to come back over and quilt everything at the end. So my goal is just to secure this reasonably well enough. So I'm using a stitch length that's probably around 1/4 inch, maybe a scant 1/4 inch. And I am going through the background. I'm traveling along the back of the block. And then when I come back up through, I come through both layers, but I just catch the very, very edge of the circle. Then back down through the background piece, travel another 1/4 inch or so, come back up right through that edge, and catch it. And so if you look closely, it's pretty hard to see my stitches because I'm using that thin thread and I'm catching just the very edge. This is what it looks like on the back, if you can see. It's just like long, like 1/4 inch stitches. And so that's what I would do. I would go around the entire perimeter of the circle, and then I have got my circle block. I will show one more thing. This pattern also has some of these half circle shapes. And so I'll show you briefly how I put these together. I don't use any thread to baste it, just because it's not a full circle, but I start the same way. I use my template. I'm gonna trim around the edge of the block to give myself that roughly 1/4 inch seam allowance on all sides. And with this one, I really just, I fold it with my fingers and press. I do use my starch trick again. Not trick, just use starch. It helps press everything nicely. So I'll brush it along the bottom. I like to fold up the bottom of this first, just to kind of give myself that straight edge, that reference edge for when I go to do the curve. So there's the bottom. Then I'm going to do the same thing here. So brush on some starch. And then start at one corner and I just fold. I pull the fabric pretty tightly because I want to get as nice, as smooth a curve as possible. Your fabric is going to gather a little bit on the back because you're doing that curve. But that's expected. I'm going to come over here and do this other corner before I finish the curve, because these corners are kind of key. And finish the curve. So you can see I got my template a little bit offset. The seam allowance over here is bigger than the seam allowance over here, but again, it's going to be okay in the long run. All right, that's pressed pretty well. I may have actually folded my template a little bit. Yep. Take my template out, give it another good press. And I'm gonna finagle this corner just a little bit to make it nice and round, because I pulled the fabric almost a little bit too hard and it folded my template. There we go. And so for this, for the game night pattern, here's the one of the other shapes is this half circle. And then also you will have some of these small circles. To baste these, you will do it exactly the same way that I did the large circle, although I do recommend for your gathering stitch, you make the gathering stitch shorter, since the curve that you're gathering the fabric around is a steeper curve. But other than that, it's the exact same process. So I hope that has been helpful, and you will enjoy doing some hand applique. Thanks.